The phone slipped from Margaret Wilson's wrinkled hands, clattering onto the hardwood floor of her modest living room. At 76, she had learned to expect disappointment, but this call from her daughter-in-law had blindsided her completely. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but we've decided it's best if you don't join us on the family vacation to Europe." Rebecca's voice had been gentle but firm. "The itinerary is just too demanding for someone your age. We'll be walking for hours each day, changing hotels frequently. You understand, don't you? It wouldn't be fair to slow everyone down." Margaret stared at the fallen phone, the tinny sound of Rebecca's voice still audible. Slowly, she bent to retrieve it, her joints protesting as she straightened back up. I see," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "When did you all decide this?" "We discussed it at Sunday dinner last week. Everyone agreed it makes the most sense. Sunday dinner, the one she'd missed because she'd been volunteering at the hospital. The dinner she'd sent her famous apple pie to, made with her own hands despite her arthritis. But I've been looking forward to this trip for months," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've already bought new walking shoes and a travel journal. I know, and we're sorry. But Jason and I think it's for the best. The kids were disappointed too, but they understand. We'll bring you back something nice from Paris." Paris, the city she'd dreamed of visiting since she was a young girl. The city her late husband Harold had promised to take her to. For their 50th anniversary, a milestone they never reached before cancer took him 5 years ago. "Of course," Margaret said automatically. "I understand." After hanging up, she sat, motionless in her armchair, the one Harold had always claimed as his own. Outside, spring sunshine bathed her carefully tended garden in golden light. The roses she'd planted 40 years ago were just beginning to bloom. On the mantelpiece, family photos chronicled a lifetime of memories. Her son Jason's graduation, her grandchildren's birthdays, the family Christmas where everyone had worn matching sweaters she'd knitted herself. Her gaze drifted to a desk in the corner, where a neat stack of papers sat beside her checkbook. Confirmation emails, receipts, and a folder labeled Family Europe Trip 2024. Margaret Wilson had never been one to make a scene. Growing up during harder times had taught her to swallow disappointment, to put others first, to make do. But as she looked at those papers, proof of the $47,000 she had quietly transferred to her son's account 6 months ago to help with a family vacation, something shifted inside her. She reached for her reading glasses and the folder. Inside was the original itinerary she'd helped plan: London, Paris, Rome, Barcelona, first-class accommodations, private tours, a chartered yacht along the Italian coast. "Too demanding for someone my age," she murmured, running her finger over the reservation for the suite at the Ritz Paris de Hotel she'd specifically requested. Margaret glanced at another photo on the mantel, herself at 70, standing triumphantly atop Machu Picchu after a 4-day trek. Harold had taken that picture, both of them laughing at how she'd outpaced guides half their age. Her cell phone buzzed with a text from her grandson. 17-year-old Ethan, "Sorry, you can't come to Europe, Grandma. Dad says it's better this way. Love you." Margaret set down her phone and walked to the window. Across the street, her neighbor George was walking his dog despite having had a hip replacement just 3 months ago. She made her decision in that moment. For once in her life, Margaret Wilson wasn't going to quietly accept being sidelined. She picked up her phone again and dialed a number she rarely used. "Hello, this is Margaret Wilson. I'd like to speak with Mr. Thornton, please." "Yes, I'll hold. As she waited, she opened her laptop and navigated to her online banking portal. The screen showed a healthy balance, the result of Harold's careful investments and her own frugal living. Mr. Thornton, it's Margaret Wilson. I need your help with something rather important. It concerns my son's family vacation to Europe next month. Yes, the one I financed. I believe it's time for a little clarification. Margaret Wilson had never considered herself remarkable. Born in 1948 to working-class parents in a small Connecticut town, she'd lived through decades of American history without ever making headlines. But those who knew her well understood that beneath her soft-spoken exterior lay a spine of steel and a mind sharp as a tack. In her modest home paid off 20 years ago, evidence of a life well lived filled every corner. Bookshelves overflowed with well-worn classics and travel guides. A piano in the corner still played daily despite arthritic fingers. Photographs chronicling 7 decades of memories. As she prepared her morning tea the day after Rebecca's call, Margaret's mind drifted back through the chapters of her life. She'd put herself through nursing school in the 1960s, working night shifts to pay tuition. That's where she'd met Harold, a young doctor with kind eyes and a terrible sense of humor. They'd married in 1970. A simple ceremony followed by a honeymoon camping in the Adirondacks because they couldn't afford more. Jason had come along 3 years later, their only child, born after 2 heartbreaking miscarriages. Margaret had scaled back her nursing career to raise him, returning to part-time work only when he started school. We gave him everything, Harold, she murmured to the empty kitchen, a habit she'd developed since becoming a widow. Maybe that was our mistake. The kitchen timer chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret removed a batch of blueberry muffins from the oven, her weekly offering for the hospital volunteers meeting. Even in retirement, she still put in 15 hours a week at the same hospital where she'd once worked. Now reading to children in the pediatric ward, her phone rang her friend, Eleanor, right on schedule. So what did Rebecca say about the trip? Eleanor asked after pleasantries. Margaret's hand tightened around her teacup. They've decided I'm too old to keep up. They don't want me to join them. They what? Eleanor's voice rose in indignation. After you paid for the whole thing. They don't know that I know they're still going, Margaret explained. Rebecca thinks I believe they cancelled altogether. Jason hasn't called me himself. That coward, Eleanor snapped. What are you going to do? I'm not entirely sure yet, Margaret admitted. But I've called Mr. Thornton, your financial advisor. Good. Hit them where it hurts. Margaret sighed. I don't want to hurt them, Eleanor. I just want them to understand. After hanging up, Margaret moved to her study, once Harold's domain, now her command center. On the wall hung her degrees, nursing, then the MBA she'd earned in her 50s, taking night classes while working full-time after Jason left for college. What her family didn't fully appreciate was that Margaret had managed the family finances for decades. Harold had been brilliant with medicine, but hopeless with money. It was Margaret who had invested his salary wisely, who had purchased rental properties during the 1980s recession, who had built a portfolio that now generated more income than she could spend. She opened her laptop and checked her calendar. The family was scheduled to leave in 3 weeks. First stop London, where they'd booked the Savoy Hotel, or rather, where she had booked it through her travel agent. Using her credit card, Margaret picked up a framed photo from her desk. Jason, at his medical school graduation, beaming between his proud parents. He had his father's height and her determination. Somewhere along the way, though, success had changed him. The modest upbringing she and Harold had provided seemed forgotten, replaced by country club memberships and status symbols. Rebecca had accelerated that transformation. A corporate lawyer from a wealthy family, she'd introduced Jason to a world of privilege Margaret had never sought. Their children, Ethan and 14-year-old Lily, were growing up with advantages Margaret could hardly imagine. "I don't begrudge them success," she told Harold's photo, "but I won't be discarded." The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Through the window, she saw George from across the street, holding a container. "Brought you some of Helen's chicken soup," he said when she opened the door. "She made too much again." Margaret smiled. George and Helen had been neighbors for 30 years. "Come in for coffee," she offered. "I need advice from someone who won't tell me I'm being petty." Over coffee and muffins, she explained the situation. "You know what burns me up," George said, his bushy eyebrows furrowing. "They think being our age makes us burdens, like we haven't earned our place at the table." Margaret nodded. "Exactly. I don't want revenge, George. I just want respect." "Then show them who you really are," he said simply, "not who they think you are." After George left, Margaret returned to her study with renewed purpose. She opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound journal, her travel diary. Inside were accounts of the 23 countries she and Harold had visited after his retirement. Their trek through Nepal, scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef at age 65, volunteering at a medical clinic in Guatemala at 72, to demanding for someone my age. She repeated, a small smile forming on her lips. She picked up the phone and dialed. "Mr. Thornton, I've made my decision. Here's what I need you to do." The Wilson family dinner table had always been Margaret's domain. Sunday roasts, holiday feasts, birthday celebrations, orchestrated by her capable hands for decades. Now, sitting at her son's expansive dining table as a guest, she felt like a stranger in a familiar play. "More wine, Mum," Jason offered, already pouring before she could answer. "Just half, please," she said, covering her glass. "I'm driving," Jason frowned. "You shouldn't be driving after dark at your age." Margaret bit back a retort. This dinner too, weeks before their scheduled departure for Europe, had been her idea. A chance to clear the air, she'd told Jason on the phone. He'd sounded relieved, probably expecting her to graciously accept her exclusion from the trip. "So," Rebecca said brightly, passing a platter of store-bought lasagna that couldn't compare to Margaret's homemade recipe, "we've finalized all the details for the trip. The kids are so excited." "I bet they are," Margaret smiled, looking at her grandchildren. "Europe is magical." Ethan, lanky and perpetually hunched over his phone, glanced up. "Dad says we're staying at like the fanciest hotels. The Savoy in London," Rebecca nodded, "and the Ritz in Paris." "Sounds expensive," Margaret commented mildly. Jason shifted in his seat. "Well, we've been saving, and that bonus came through." Margaret took a small sip of wine. The bonus, of course. 6 months ago, Jason had called her in a panic. His investment in a medical startup had gone south, taking a significant chunk of their savings with it. The Europe trip planned as a celebration of Rebecca making partner at her law firm was in jeopardy. Margaret had transferred the money the next day. "Consider it an early inheritance," she'd told him. "I want you all to have experiences, not just wait for me to die to enjoy my money." "Grandma, did you ever go to Europe?" Lily asked, her 14-year-old face bright with curiosity. Many times, sweetheart, Margaret smiled. Your grandfather and I loved to travel, really. Lily seemed surprised. Like, where did you go? Before Margaret could answer, Rebecca interjected. Your grandmother and grandfather took some senior bus tours, honey. Very different from our trip. Margaret set down her fork. Actually, Harold and I backpacked through Eastern Europe when the Berlin Wall came down. We stayed in hostels and took overnight trains. The table fell silent, double quotes you, ... backpacked. Jason looked genuinely confused. Dad hated camping. People contain multitudes, son, Margaret said quietly. There's a lot about your father and me you never asked about. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. So, Margaret continued brightly, tell me about your itinerary. I'd love to hear the details. For the next 20 minutes, Rebecca dominated the conversation, detailing their planned visits to the Louvre, the Colosseum, Sagrada Familia. Margaret listened attentively, occasionally offering a small comment. The side entrance to the Vatican. Museums has a shorter line, or that restaurant near the Eiffel Tower is overrated. Each comment was met with surprise, quickly masked. Mum, how do you know these things? Jason finally asked. I read, she said simply. And I've been to all those places. On those bus tours, Rebecca added. Some, yes, Margaret conceded. Others. On our own, your father and I visited Paris 4 times. Jason's phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked at Margaret with a frown. Mum, why is Mr. Thornton trying to reach me on a Sunday evening? Margaret dabbed her lips with a napkin. Probably about the trip. What about it? Well, she said, her voice steady. He's likely calling to confirm that the funds have been properly allocated. The hotels, the private tours, the yacht charter along the Amalfi coast. Rebecca's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. What are you talking about? The $47,000 I transferred to Jason's account 6 months ago, Margaret said. Specifically for this family vacation. The silence that followed was deafening. Mum, Jason began, his face flushing, that money was to help us after my investment mistake. We never said, you said, and I quote, we might have to cancel our Europe trip because of this loss. I gave you the money the next day. What did you think it was for? Rebecca set down her glass. Margaret, we're very grateful for your help during that difficult time, but that money became part of our general funds. We've worked hard for this vacation. I see, Margaret nodded. And when exactly did you decide I was too old to join you on the trip I financed? Ethan looked up from his phone, suddenly interested. Lily's eyes widened. It's not about age, Jason protested weakly. It's about the pace. The activities we've planned are strenuous. Like what? Margaret challenged. Walking tours, museum visits, boat rides. Mum, be reasonable. You get tired walking around the mall. Because the mall is boring, Jason. I walked the Camino de Santiago 2 years after your father died. That's 500 miles across northern Spain, with a backpack. Jason's jaw dropped. You did what? Your father and I promised each other we'd do it together when he retired. After he passed, I did it in his memory. Margaret's voice softened. There's so much you don't know because you never asked. Rebecca cleared her throat. Regardless of the past, Margaret, we've made our arrangements. The tickets are purchased, the hotels are booked. Yes, Margaret agreed. They are. In my name, the room went completely still. What? Jason whispered. Margaret reached into her purse and removed a folder. Mr. Thornton helped me trace the money. You used it to pay off credit card debt and buy that new golf membership, Jason. The actual trip was booked using my credit card, which Rebecca borrowed when she forgot hers during that shopping trip in February. She opened the folder and laid out printouts of receipts and confirmations. The Savoy, the Ritz, the private tours of the Vatican, the yacht charter, all in my name. I worked with the travel agent directly. She thought it was so sweet that my son wanted to surprise me with a family trip. Rebecca's face had gone pale. This is ridiculous. You can't just— I can, Margaret interrupted gently. And I have. Mr. Thornton has been trying to reach you because we need to discuss how we're going to handle this situation, like adults. Jason stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. Mum, what do you want? Margaret folded her hands on the table. I want what I've always wanted, Jason, to be part of this family. Not as an afterthought or a burden, but as a person with value and experiences to share. She looked around at their shocked faces. Her son, his wife, her grandchildren felt a profound sadness mixed with determination. So, she said quietly, shall we discuss our family vacation plans? The morning after the explosive dinner, Margaret sat in her garden, deadheading roses as the early summer sun warmed her shoulders. Gardening had always helped her think, the repetitive motions soothing her mind as she processed the previous night's confrontation. Jason hadn't called yet. She hadn't expected him to. Her son had always needed time to process emotional situations, like his father in that way. As she snipped another faded bloom, her mind drifted back to 1985. Jason had been 12, gangly and serious, already showing the academic promise that would eventually lead him to medical school. Mum, why don't we have a big house like Michael's family? He'd asked one day after visiting a school friend. His dad's a doctor too. Margaret had set aside the bills she'd been sorting. Your father and I choose to live differently, Jason. We save for your education and for experiences, not for things. What kind of experiences? She'd shown him their travel fund jar, where they put spare change and small bills. Next summer, we're taking you to the Grand Canyon. We'll hike down to the bottom and camp by the river. Jason had wrinkled his nose. That sounds hard. The best experiences often are, she'd told him. But they're the ones you remember forever. They'd made that trip, and many others: national parks, historical sites, even a medical mission to Honduras when Jason was 16. Harold had wanted their son to see that medicine wasn't just about affluent patients in suburban practices. When had that curious, thoughtful boy transformed into a man who measured success by square footage and country club memberships? The garden gate creaked, pulling Margaret from her memories. Eleanor appeared, carrying 2 coffee cups. I figured you'd be out here, her friend said, handing over a steaming mug. How did it go last night? Margaret recounted the dinner conversation while Eleanor listened, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. The look on their faces, Margaret sighed, like they'd never really seen me before. They haven't, Eleanor said bluntly. They see a stereotype, not a person. My kids are the same way. The moment I turned 70, they started talking to me like I was either deaf or simple-minded. Margaret nodded. It had started subtly after Harold died, Jason checking her financial decisions, Rebecca suggesting simpler recipes for family gatherings, both of them exchanging glances when she mentioned future plans. What hurts most, Margaret admitted, is that I raised Jason to be different. Harold and I taught him to value people for who they are, not what they can do for him. People change, Eleanor said, especially when they marry into money. Margaret frowned. Rebecca's not the problem. She's just ... different from us. Her mind traveled back to the first time she'd met Rebecca 20 years ago. Jason had brought her home for Christmas, her polished law student with perfect hair and a dazzling smile. Margaret had tried to connect, sharing stories of her own college days, but Rebecca had seemed almost embarrassed by these glimpses into a less privileged life. She comes from a different world, Harold had observed privately. Old money, country clubs, finishing schools. Our son is climbing the social ladder. As long as he's happy, Margaret had replied, though something in her heart had ached at the growing distance she sensed. The wedding had been lavish, paid for by Rebecca's parents, stark contrast to Margaret and Harold's simple ceremony. The honeymoon in the Maldives, the house in the exclusive neighborhood, the private schools for the children, each step had taken Jason further from his roots. "You're too accepting," Eleanor interrupted her thoughts. "I'd have lost my mind years ago." Margaret smiled sadly. "Harold always said I had the patience of a saint and the memory of an elephant." "Well, the elephant part came in handy last night," Eleanor chuckled. "I wish I could have seen their faces when you pulled out those receipts." The memory brought a small smile to Margaret's lips. "It wasn't about humiliating them, Elle. I just wanted them to see Marily, see me." Her phone buzzed with a text. "Jason, can we talk? Alone." "He wants to meet," she told Eleanor. "Good. What's your next move?" Margaret set down her pruning shears. "That depends on him." Later that afternoon, Jason arrived at her house, looking uncomfortable in the home where he'd grown up. Margaret had prepared iced tea and his favorite lemon cookies, a peace offering of sorts. They sat in the sunroom, awkward silence stretching between them until Jason finally spoke. "Mum, I owe you an apology." Margaret waited, giving him space to continue. "I should have been honest about the money," he said. "When you transferred it, we were in a bad place financially. The investment loss, Ethan's college visits, Lily's braces, it all hit at once." "You could have told me," Margaret said gently. "I've always helped when you needed it." "That's just it," Jason sighed. "I'm 49 years old. I shouldn't need my mother bailing me out. It's embarrassing." Margaret studied her son's face, the lines around his eyes, the grey at his temples. When had he become middle-aged? "Is that why you didn't want me on the trip?" Embarrassment. Jason looked down. "Not exactly," Rebecca thought. ... We both thought. It would be easier without accommodating your needs." "My needs," Margaret repeated flatly. "Mum, you're 76. Travel is exhausting, even for us. The itinerary we planned is packed with activities." Margaret rose and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound album. She placed it in front of Jason and opened to a page showing herself and Harold standing on a mountain peak, snow-capped Himalayan mountains stretching behind them. "This was 6 years ago," she said. 2 months before your father's diagnosis." She turned more pages. Margaret scuba diving, Margaret on a camel, Margaret and Harold dancing on a cruise ship deck. "Your father and I lived, Jason. After you left home, after we retired, we really lived." Jason stared at the photos, recognition slowly dawning. "I had no idea, because you never asked," she said simply. "You assumed we were just waiting around to get old." The truth of her words hung in the air between them. "I don't know what to say," Jason finally admitted. "Say you'll reconsider including me in the family trip," Margaret suggested. "Not out of obligation, but because I've earned my place there. Jason looked at his mother, really looked at her perhaps for the first time in years. I need to talk to Rebecca. Margaret nodded. Of course you do. She's your wife. But remember, Jason, this is ultimately about respect, not just a vacation. As she walked him to the door, Jason paused. De Camino de Santiago, did you really walk 500 miles alone? Margaret smiled. Not alone. I made friends along the way. That's what happens when you're open to experiences, Jason. The world opens up to you, too. After he left, Margaret returned to the sunroom and looked at the photo album still open on the table. Harold's smiling face looked back at her from their Himalayan adventure. I miss you every day, she whispered. But I'm still living, Harold. I promise you that. 3 days passed without word from Jason or Rebecca. Margaret kept busy, tending her garden, volunteering at the hospital, and meeting with her investment club, a group of retirees who had collectively outperformed most professional fund managers for the past decade. None of her family knew about this aspect of her life either. On Thursday morning, her phone rang. Rebecca, not Jason. Margaret, her daughter-in-law's voice, was professionally pleasant. I wonder if we might meet for lunch today. Just the two of us. Margaret agreed, suggesting the cafe at the art museum, neutral territory with excellent quiche. As she dressed for the meeting, she considered her approach. Rebecca was a formidable negotiator. She hadn't become partner at her law firm by accident. The museum cafe was busy when Margaret arrived, but Rebecca had secured a corner table, already nursing a sparkling water. She stood when she spotted Margaret, offering a perfunctory hug. You look well, Rebecca said, assessing Margaret's linen dress and simple pearl earrings, a gift from Harold on their 40th anniversary. Thank you. How are the children? Confused, Rebecca admitted, getting straight to business. They don't understand why there's suddenly a question about who's going on this trip. Margaret nodded. I imagine that's difficult. Children should be shielded from adult disagreements. Exactly, Rebecca leaned forward, which is why I wanted to speak with you privately. Mother to mother. Margaret doubted Rebecca saw her that way, but she nodded encouragingly. Jason and I have discussed the situation, Rebecca continued. We recognize that the funding for this trip came from you, and we should have been more transparent about that. I appreciate the acknowledgement. However, Rebecca's tone shifted slightly. The fact remains that this trip was planned with a specific vision in mind. A last hurrah before Ethan leaves for college. Family bonding on our terms. And I don't fit into that vision. Margaret stated calmly that Rebecca had the grace to look uncomfortable. It's not personal, Margaret. It's practical. The pace we've planned, the activities, they're designed for people who are more active. Margaret took a sip of water. Rebecca, may I ask you something? In your law practice, have you ever underestimated an opponent based on their appearance or age? Rebecca frowned. Of course not. That would be unprofessional. Yet you've done exactly that with me, Margaret said gently. You've made assumptions about my capabilities without evidence. That's not fair. We're concerned about your well-being, are you? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Or are you concerned about how having an elderly mother along might cramp your style at the Ritz? Rebecca's cheeks flushed. That's uncalled for. Perhaps, Margaret conceded, but so is treating me like a child who can't assess her own limitations. Their salads arrived, creating a momentary pause in the conversation. Margaret used the opportunity to shift gears. Tell me about the yacht charter along the Amalfi coast, she said conversationally. It looks wonderful in the brochure. Rebecca seemed relieved by the change of subject. It's a 6-hour private cruise with lunch on board. The children are excited about swimming in the Mediterranean. I've swum in the Mediterranean, Margaret smiled. Harold and I spent a month in a little village near Positano when he took a sabbatical in 1995. The water is divine. Rebecca looked surprised. I didn't know that. There's a lot you don't know about me, Margaret said, which is partly my fault. I've played the role expected of me, the doting grandmother, the supportive mother, and I've made myself small to fit into the space you allocated for me in your lives. Rebecca set down her fork. Margaret, let me finish, please. Margaret said firmly, I've been reflecting on why this trip matters so much to me. It's not just about Paris or Rome or Barcelona. It's about being seen as a full person with experiences to share, not just an obligation to be managed. Rebecca was silent for a moment. I never thought of it that way. Few people do, Margaret said. Ageism is the last acceptable prejudice. You'd never exclude someone from a family event because of their race or gender, but age, that's considered. Practical thinking. Rebecca looked genuinely uncomfortable now. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that I join the family vacation as planned, Margaret said. I'll cover my own expenses. Of course, though technically, I've already paid for everyone's. If there are activities too strenuous for me, I'll find alternatives. I'm quite capable of entertaining myself for a few hours. And if we refuse, Margaret met her gaze steadily, then I'll be forced to contact the hotels, tour companies, and the yacht charter to explain that there's been a misunderstanding about the bookings made in my name with my credit card. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat. It's a consequence, Margaret corrected. I'd prefer we find a solution that preserves everyone's dignity. They finished their lunch in tense silence. As they waited for the check, Rebecca finally spoke. I'll discuss this with Jason, but I want you to know that if you do join us, we won't be changing our plans to accommodate you. If you can't keep up, you'll be on your own. Margaret smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. That evening, Margaret received a text from Ethan. Dad and Mum are fighting about the trip. What's going on, Grandma? She sighed, hating that the children were caught in the middle. She called Ethan instead of texting back. Your parents are sorting out some details about the vacation, she explained. Adult stuff, nothing for you to worry about. Are you coming with us now? He asked. Lily heard Mum say something about it. Margaret chose her words carefully. That's being discussed. Would you want me to come? There was a pause. Yeah, I guess. You're pretty cool for a grandma. And you make better snacks than Mum. Margaret laughed. High praise, indeed. Plus, Ethan added, his voice dropping, you never make me feel bad about my grades like Dad does. Margaret's heart ached at this glimpse into her grandson's insecurities. Jason had always been academically gifted. Perhaps he struggled to understand Ethan's different learning style. Everyone has different strengths, she told him. Your grandfather was brilliant with people but terrible at math. I balanced our checkbook for 40 years. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her garden as twilight descended. Fireflies began to appear, their gentle lights blinking in the growing darkness. Harold had loved evenings like this. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jason, we need to talk. Coming over tomorrow morning. Margaret set down her phone and watched the fireflies, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Whatever happened, she had already won a small victory. For perhaps the first time in years, her family was seeing her really seeing her as a person, to be reckoned with, not just accommodated. The thought brought a smile to her face as darkness fell completely around her. Jason arrived at precisely 10 a.m. the next morning, his posture stiff as he entered the house where he'd grown up. Margaret had prepared coffee and his favorite cinnamon rolls a peace offering, but also a reminder of the care she'd always shown him. "Rebecca told me about your lunch," he began without preamble, declining the offered pastry. "I thought she might," Margaret replied calmly, pouring coffee for them both. "She's very efficient." Jason paced the living room, stopping at the mantel, to stare at family photos. "Mum, this has gotten out of hand. You're essentially blackmailing us into taking you to Europe." Margaret set down the coffee pot with deliberate care. "Is that how you see it? Interesting. How else should I see it? You're threatening to cancel reservations if we don't include you." "I'm pointing out that those reservations were made in my name, with my money," she corrected. "That's not blackmail, it's a fact." Jason turned to face her, frustration evident in his expression. "Why are you doing this? You've never been ... difficult before." The word hung in the air between them. Difficult. The label often applied to older people who refuse to be conveniently invisible. "Perhaps that's the problem," Margaret said quietly. "I've spent years accommodating everyone else's needs and wants. I've been the grandmother who babysits on demand, the mother who never questions your choices, the widow who doesn't burden her family with her grief." She gestured for Jason to sit, which he reluctantly did. "When your father died, do you know what I did the night after the funeral?" Jason shook his head. "I came home to this empty house and screamed into a pillow for an hour," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the painful memory. "I didn't call you because I didn't want to burden you with my pain. I handled the estate, the medical bills, the condolence letters, all while learning to live without my partner of 47 years. Jason looked down at his untouched coffee. "I offered to help. You offered once, perfunctorily, then flew back to your life," Margaret continued. "And I understood. You have your family, your practice. But do you know what message that sent? That my grief, my needs, were secondary, an inconvenience." Jason flinched. "That's not fair, Mum. I was grieving too." "Of course you were," Margaret acknowledged. "But you had Rebecca, the children, your work. I had ... empty rooms and memories." She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. "After the initial shock passed, I made a choice. I could either wither away in this house, waiting for occasional visits from my family, or I could build a new life. I chose the latter." "The Camino walk," Jason murmured. "That was just the beginning," Margaret said. "I joined investment clubs, took Spanish classes, volunteered with literacy programs. I built a life that's full and meaningful. But to you and Rebecca, I'm still just mum or grandma roles, not a person." Jason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that Margaret's heart ached momentarily. "I don't know what you want from me," he admitted. "I want to be seen," Margaret said simply. "Not as a burden to be managed or an obligation to be fulfilled, but as Margaret Wilsena, woman with experiences, opinions, and yes, capabilities." She leaned forward. "This trip has become symbolic, Jason. It's not just about Paris or Rome. It's about whether I have a place in this family beyond the periphery." Jason was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca thinks you're being manipulative. And what do you think?" He met her eyes. "I think I don't know you as well as I thought I did." "That's a start," Margaret smiled slightly. Because the woman who raised you, who put herself through nursing school while working nights, who managed your father's practice books while raising you, who hiked the Grand Canyon and the Inca Trail, and the Camino de Santiago, that woman is still here. She's just been invisible to you for a long time. Jason's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at his mother. Rebecca wants to know what we've decided. And have we decided something? Jason sighed deeply. If you come with us, there are conditions. We won't change our itinerary. We won't slow down for you. If you can't keep up with an activity, you'll need to find something else to do on your own. Margaret nodded. That seems reasonable. And, Jason added, his voice firmer, we need to discuss the financial situation. If you paid for this trip, we should reimburse you. That won't be necessary, Margaret said. Consider it my gift to the family. All I ask is to be included. Jason looked skeptical. Just like that. After all this drama, the drama, as you call it, was never about the money, Margaret explained patiently. It was about respect. About being excluded from a family event I had made possible without even a proper conversation. She reached across the coffee table to touch her son's hand. Jason, I don't have unlimited time left. None of us do. I want to create memories with my grandchildren while I can. I want them to know me not just as the grandmother who sends birthday checks, but as a person with stories and experiences to share. Something in Jason's expression softened. Dad always said you were the strongest person he knew. I think I'm finally understanding what he meant. Margaret smiled. Your father saw me clearly. It's one of the reasons I loved him so much. Jason's phone buzzed again. Rebecca, no doubt growing impatient. Tell her I'll be joining you on the trip, Margaret said, and that I'll be bringing my hiking boots for that walking tour in Rome. Jason raised an eyebrow. Hiking boots. Comfortable shoes are essential for cobblestone streets, Margaret said with a wink. Something I learned on my third visit to Italy. As Jason texted his wife, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The battle wasn't completely won. Rebecca would likely remain resistant, and there would be adjustments to navigate, but a significant corner had been turned. There's one more thing, Jason said, setting down his phone. The kids want to know if you'll still make your special travel snack bags for the plane. Apparently, my trail mix doesn't compare. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. Some things never change. Of course I will. As they finished their coffee, discussing practical details of the upcoming trip, Margaret noticed Jason studying her with new eye-seeing. Not just his mother, but Margaret Wilson, a woman with depths he was only beginning to discover. It was a start. The 3 weeks before, departure passed in a flurry of activity. Margaret approached the trip preparations with the efficiency of someone who had traveled extensively, methodically checking items off her list and packing with practiced precision. 1 week before their flight, she invited Ethan and Lily over for what she called a travel prep day. Rebecca dropped them off with visible reluctance, reminding them they had only 3 hours before tennis lessons. What's all this, Grandma? Lily asked, eyeing the dining room table covered with maps, guidebooks, and photo albums. Travel homework. Margaret smiled. When I visit a new place or return to one I love, why? Always do research first. It makes the experience richer. Ethan flopped into a chair. Mum already booked tours for everything. Tours are wonderful, Margaret agreed, but they don't tell you everything. For instance, did you know there's a secret room above the Sistine Chapel that few tourists ever see? Or that the best gelato in Rome is at a tiny shop that's been run by the same family for 6 generations. Lily's eyes widened. How do you know that stuff? Margaret opened one of the photo albums. Experience, dear. This was my first trip to Rome with your grandfather in 1992. The children gathered around, suddenly interested, as Margaret showed them photos of a younger version of herself and Harold, standing before the Trevi fountain, exploring the Roman Forum, sharing a pizza in a small trattoria. Grandpa looks so different, Ethan observed. Not so serious. Margaret smiled. Your grandfather was many things beyond serious. He was adventurous, funny, sometimes impulsive, much like you, Ethan. The boy looked up in surprise. Dad says, I'm not focused enough to be like Grandpa. Margaret felt a pang at this revelation. Your grandfather became focused when it mattered, with his patience, with his research. But in life, he was wonderfully spontaneous. She pulled out another album, Paris, 1997. We were supposed to stay 3 days. We ended up staying 2 weeks because your grandfather fell in love with a little bookshop near Notre Dame. The photos showed Harold and Margaret at sidewalk cafes atop the Eiffel Tower, browsing bookstalls along the Seine. You guys look ... happy, Lily said, sounding almost surprised. We were, Margaret confirmed. Very happy. Did you ever fight? Ethan asked. Margaret laughed. Of course we did. All couples disagree sometimes. Your grandfather was terrible with directions, but refused to ask for help. Once in Barcelona, we walked in circles for 3 hours because he insisted he knew where our hotel was. The children giggled at this humanizing detail about their stern grandfather. The point is, Margaret continued, travel reveals who people really are. It pushes you out of your comfort zone, challenges you, rewards you with unexpected discoveries. She pulled out a small notebook. I've made some notes for each of you, special things to look for in each city we'll visit. Little treasures that tour guides might miss. Lily took her list with genuine interest. Secret passages in the Louvre. A hidden courtyard in Barcelona. This is cool, Grandma. Much better than Dad's spreadsheet of museum opening times, Ethan agreed. Margaret smiled. Your father's spreadsheet is important too. Structure and spontaneity both have their place in travel. As they continued exploring the albums and maps, Margaret gently extracted stories from her grandchildren. Ethan's anxiety about starting college applications next year. Lily's interest in photography that her parents dismissed as a hobby. I brought my first camera to Europe when I was about your age, Margaret told Lily. Your great-grandmother thought it was a waste of film, but those photos became some of my most treasured possessions. She disappeared into her study, returning with a vintage Nikon camera. This was your grandfather's. He'd want you to have it. Lily's eyes widened. Really? But Dad said Grandpa's things were all given away after he died. Most were donated to the hospital, Margaret explained. But I kept the personal items that mattered most. Your father never asked about them. She showed Lily how to use the manual. Camera, explaining aperture and shutter speed with the fluency of someone who had spent years behind a lens. You know a lot about photography, Ethan observed. I know a lot about many things, Margaret said simply. People contain multitudes. Remember, when Rebecca arrived to collect the children, she seemed surprised to find them eagerly engaged with maps and guidebooks. They've been doing research, Margaret explained. Lily has quite an eye for composition. I've lent her Harold's old camera. For the trip, Rebecca frowned. Digital photos are more practical, Margaret. Sometimes the less practical path yields more beautiful results, Margaret replied. Like film photography, or including grandmothers on family vacations. Rebecca's lips thinned, but she said nothing as the children gathered their things, chattering excitedly about secret spots they planned to visit in Europe. After they left, Margaret returned to her packing. In her suitcase, alongside carefully rolled clothing and comfortable walking shoes, she placed a small velvet pouch containing Harold's wedding ring on a chain, her talisman for difficult journeys. She would need his strength for the days ahead. Her phone rang in her, calling for a pre-trip update. The children came over today, Margaret told her friend. I showed them photos of Harold and me in Europe. How did that go? They were surprised. Margaret admitted, they have this image of us as just old people. Seeing us young, adventurous, changed something in how they see me and Jason, Rebecca. Margaret sighed. Jason is cautiously accepting. Rebecca remains resistant. She's afraid, Eleanor said bluntly. Of what? Of you stealing the spotlight? Of her children seeing another kind of woman, one who doesn't measure success by designer labels and country club memberships. Margaret considered this. I'm not trying to compete with her. Maybe not intentionally, Eleanor said, but your very existence, vibrant, independent, experienced, hinges her narrative. After hanging up, Margaret sat in Harold's old armchair, contemplating her friend's words. Was she being fair to Rebecca? Perhaps not entirely. But after years of making herself small to accommodate others' comfort, Margaret had finally found her voice. Her gaze fell on a framed photo of herself at the summit of Kilimanjaro, trip she'd taken with Harold for their 40th anniversary. They'd trained for months, determined to reach the peak despite being in their 60s. I can do this, she whispered to Harold's memory. One more adventure. 3 days before departure, Jason called with a last-minute itinerary change. Rebecca's arranged a surprise for the kids in Paris, he explained. A private after-hours tour of the Louvre, followed by dinner on a Seine river cruise. That sounds lovely, Margaret said. What time should I be ready? A pause. Actually, Mum, this is just for the 4 of us. Rebecca pulled some strings through. A law client. It's exclusive. The familiar sting of exclusion returned, but Margaret kept her voice steady. I see. And what am I meant to do that evening? The hotel concierge can recommend restaurants nearby, Jason suggested. Or room service is excellent at the Ritz. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Room service at the Ritz, while my family enjoys a private tour of the Louvre. Jason's discomfort was palpable even through the phone. It's just one evening, Mum, of course, Margaret said. Just one evening. After hanging up, she sat motionless for several minutes, disappointment washing over her. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached for her laptop and opened her email. Dear Felipe, she began, writing to an old friend who had been a curator at the Louvre for 30 years. I find myself in Paris next week and wondered if you might be available for dinner. ... Double quotes, the reply came within the hour. Margaret. What? Wonderful timing. Not only am I available, but I'm hosting a small reception for retiring curators that evening. Several old friends would be delighted to see you again. And of course, I can arrange a special viewing of the new exhibition before the reception. ... Margaret smiled as she typed her acceptance. The game, as Sherlock Holmes would say, was afoot. The departure day dawned clear and bright. Margaret had arranged for a car service to take her to Jason and Rebecca's home, where the family would depart together for the airport. She arrived precisely on time, her single suitcase and carry-on efficiently packed for the 2-week journey. The scene at her son's house was considerably less organized. Suitcases littered the foyer, Lily was frantically searching for her phone charger, and Rebecca was on a work call despite their imminent departure. "Grandma," Ethan greeted her with genuine warmth. "Dad's freaking out about getting to the airport 3 hours early. International travel requires buffer time," Margaret said, winking at her grandson. "Though your grandfather and I once made a flight to Bangkok with only 12 minutes to spare." Jason emerged from the kitchen, looking harried. "Mum, good, you're here. Can you help Lily find her charger while I load the car? And remind Rebecca we need to leave in 10 minutes. Margaret nodded, amused at how quickly she'd transitioned from unwanted tag-along to useful assistant. She found Lily's charger plugged behind her nightstand, gently extracted Rebecca from her work call with a firm tap on her watch, and had everyone assembled in the foyer 5 minutes later. "How did you do that?" Jason asked, impressed despite himself. "Organization is a skill like any other," Margaret replied. "I managed a hospital ward with 30 patients and 12 staff. A family of 5 is relatively simple by comparison." The drive to the airport was tense, with Rebecca finishing emails and Jason fretting about traffic. In the third row of the SUV, Margaret sat between her grandchildren, quietly distributing the promised snack bags each, personalized with their favorite treats. "You remembered I liked the sour gummies now, not the sweet ones," Lily said, surprised. "Of course," Margaret smiled. "I pay attention." At the airport, Margaret navigated check-in with practiced ease, producing their boarding passes and passports in the correct order, moving efficiently through security and guiding them to their gate with time to spare. "You've done this before," Jason observed as they settled in the lounge. "Many times," Margaret confirmed. "Your father and I preferred aisle seats on overnight flights, easier for bathroom trips. But I requested a window for Lily since it's her first transatlantic crossing." Rebecca looked up from her phone. "How did you know our seating assignments?" "I arranged those through our travel agent. I called the airline," Margaret said simply. "I wanted to make sure we were all seated together." The first hint of real tension surfaced when they boarded the plane. Despite Margaret's efforts, their seats were scattered throughout business class, Jason and Rebecca together, the children in another row, and Margaret by herself near the back of the section. "I specifically requested family seating," Margaret frowned, showing her boarding pass to the flight attendant. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but these arrangements were confirmed last week," the attendant explained. "We're fully booked in business class." Rebecca avoided Margaret's questioning gaze. The seating was adjusted to accommodate everyone's preferences. "I see," Margaret said, understanding perfectly. This was Rebecca's subtle reminder of who was in control, rather than protest. Margaret settled into her assigned seat, removed her book from her carry-on, and arranged her space with the efficiency of an experienced traveler. If Rebecca expected complaints, she would be disappointed midway through the flight. As the cabin lights dimmed for sleep, Ethan appeared beside Margaret's seat. "Can't sleep," he admitted. "Too excited." Margaret patted the empty seat beside her. One advantage of her isolated position: sit for a while. "I have a trick for long flights." From her bag, she produced a small notebook. "I've traveled to 37 countries, and in each one, I write down 3 things. Something beautiful I saw, something new I learned, and something that challenged me." She showed him entries dating back decades, Harold and her observations. From trips around the world. That's cool, Ethan said, genuinely interested. Dad just takes pictures of famous stuff and moves on. Different travel styles, Margaret said diplomatically. What are you most looking forward to seeing? They talked quietly for nearly an hour about architecture, history, food until Ethan's eyes began to droop. Margaret walked him back to his seat, tucking a small travel pillow behind his neck the way she had when he was small. Returning to her seat, she found Rebecca watching her. He should be sleeping, her daughter-in-law said. Tomorrow is a full day. He will sleep better now, Margaret replied. Sometimes connection is more restful than silence. Rebecca studied her for a moment. You're different on this trip. More assertive. Not different, Margaret corrected gently. Just more visible. The plane landed at Heathrow early the next morning. Despite the overnight flight, Margaret felt reasonably refreshed, another skill honed through years of nursing and travel. The family collected their luggage and found their driver, who transported them to the Savoy Hotel in a spacious van. The grandeur of the historic hotel clearly impressed the children, who gazed wide-eyed at the elegant lobby. Rebecca approached the check-in desk with confidence. Margaret hanging back with the luggage and tired grandchildren. Minutes passed. Rebecca's posture grew increasingly tense as she spoke with the clerk. Finally, she returned to the group, her expression tight. There seems to be some confusion with our reservation, she said, her voice low. They only have 3 rooms available, not 4 as we requested. What does that mean? Jason asked. It means, Rebecca said, glancing at Margaret, that someone will need to share. Margaret stepped forward. What exactly did the clerk say? Rebecca's lips thinned. That the reservation was modified last week to consolidate rooms. They assumed we wanted to save money. I see, Margaret nodded. Let me speak with them. Before Rebecca could object, Margaret approached the desk. Good morning, I'm Margaret Wilson. I believe there's some confusion with our booking. The clerk checked his computer. Yes, Mrs. Wilson. We received instructions to modify the original 4-room booking to 3 rooms. The confirmation was sent to your email. I see, Margaret said, though she had received no such email. And who requested this change? The clerk checked again. The request came through your travel agent, but the confirmation email went to ... He paused. A Rebecca Wilson. Margaret turned to look at her daughter-in-law, who had the grace to flush slightly. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Margaret said to the clerk. We do need 4 rooms as originally booked. I'm terribly sorry, but we're fully committed for the weekend. The clerk apologized. The best we can offer is 3 rooms, with a rollaway bed in one. Margaret considered the situation. This was clearly Rebecca's attempt to force her to share a room with Lily, diminishing her independence and comfort. I understand, Margaret said finally. We'll take the 3 rooms, and could you please recommend another hotel nearby? I may have a colleague join me tomorrow. The clerk brightened. Of course. The Fielding Hotel is just around the corner. Lovely boutique property. Shall I call to check availability? Please do, Margaret smiled. For 1 room, starting tonight. Jason approached as the clerk made the call. Mum, what are you doing? Solving a problem, Margaret said calmly. Since our original reservation was mysteriously changed, I'll stay elsewhere. Margaret's journey to be truly seen by her family continues in the next video.